What menstrual products do you use during your period?
What menstrual product do you use during your period?
What menstrual products do you use during your period?
I use the Modest sanitary napkin.
I use sanitary napkins.
I use pads.
I use pads or sanitary napkins.
I use pads.
Pads, usually from Whisper.
I use sanitary napkin.
I use sanitary pads.
Sanitary napkin, Whisper.
I use pads.
I use Modest napkins.
I use Kotex or Jeunesse sanitary napkins.
Pads. I've always used pads.
I use sanitary napkins.
I use a sanitary napkin.
I use sanitary napkins.
I use Modest regular and overnight pads.
I usually use napkins or pads.
I use pads from Modest.
I use sanitary pads, the two different sizes, overnight and regular, and afterwards I use panty liner.
I use pads and panty liners.
I have napkins, usually in the brand Modest or Whisper.
I use pads.
Pads or napkins.
So for regular flow, I usually use this Ultra Thin Kotex one. And for strong flow, I use this thick Kotex one.
I use pads or sanitary napkins.
Right now, I'm using pads, but before I tried to experiment with pills which didn't work for me. So I stick with pads.
I use pads.
I use sanitary napkins.
Personally, I use napkins and liners.
I use Whisper pads as well as Kotex.
What I use are Modest overnight and Charmy menstrual pads.
I personally use 3 products. It's either Charmy, Whisper, or Sister sanitary napkin.
I use sanitary napkins, preferably Modest.
For me, I use napkins. I use sanitary napkins.
I either use the overnight pad of Sisters or Charmy.
I use cottony sanitary pads or napkins.
I use sanitary napkins, otherwise known as menstrual pads.
So for me, I use napkins, specifically Modest or Kotex.
I always use napkins, specifically the brand Kotex.
So napkin wise, I use always.
I use Carefree's panty liners. I also use Whisper's regular non-wing pads. And lastly, I use Modest's regular pads.
Modest.
I use napkins.
I use Modest.
I use sanitary pads.
I use sanitary napkins.
So I use this Modest Ultra Thin and this Kotex Soft and Smooth Thick. And lastly, this Kotex Overnight Pad.
I use pads for sanitary napkins.
The menstrual products that I use are sanitary napkins.
I use napkins.
I use feminine wash and sanitary napkins.
Pads.
Whisper sanitary pads.
I use sanitary pads.
So typically I just use napkins with wings.
I would usually use sanitary pads.
I use sanitary napkins.
The menstrual product I use during my period is a napkin.
I use pads or napkins.
Pads. I use disposable sanitary napkins.
I use feminine pads, brand Charmy.
A menstrual pad, specifically Modest and Whisper.
The menstrual products that I use during my period are pads. I use pads.
I use sanitary napkins or pads.
I use pads and panty liners.
I use sanitary napkins and panty liners.
So I use panty liners before and after. And then I use sanitary napkins during my period.
I use sanitary napkins or panty liners.
I usually use sanitary pads, but I also use panty liners depending on how heavy or how light my flow is.
I personally use liners and napkins.
I use sanitary napkins and liners.
I will either use sanitary napkins or panty liners.
I use pads, panty liners.
Personally, I use napkins and panty liners. During my period, I use Modest napkins, and on the latter days, I use Carefree liners.
I use pads, both dry and cotton, as well as panty liners.
I use Whisper Skin Love pads and Carefree panty liners.
I use an overnight pad
menstrual underwear, menstrual panties, and my trusty pasador.
Me, I use both disposable and reusable pads.
Reusable sanitary napkins.
Reusable sanitary napkins.
I personally use pads, but I also have experience using tampons.
If I'm not doing anything that day, like I'm just at home sleeping or going to class, then I use pads. However, if I know I'm gonna be doing any physical activity like exercising, swimming, or walking around a lot, I prefer to use tampons because they're more comfortable.
I only use napkins, so the ones for heavy flow, liners, and the winged ones. And the only time I use tampons is if I am gonna go swimming or to the beach and I'm on my period that day.
I prefer using tampons, but since they're usually hard to find in convenience stores and supermarkets, I mostly just go for sanitary pads.
I use napkins, then feminine wash or wipes, then sometimes tampons.
I often use tampons and pads depending on my menstrual flow.
I always use pads, but sometimes tampons too.
I use pads and tampons.
I use pads and sometimes I use tampons.
I use pads, but at times I also use tampons.
I use menstrual pads or tampons when I work out.
I use menstrual pads right now, but I intend to look into using menstrual cups in the near future.
I use the Anytime menstrual cup.
A menstrual cup, which was a whole lot more environmentally friendly and a whole lot more cost effective.
I use a menstrual cup when I'm on my period because it's eco-friendly and it's really not that intimidating if people think about it. It's easy to use.